Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the Neanderthals and this huge theory that's coming out about how they had probably more than likely had some sort of type of healthcare, and basically the nuances of their observations of their diet, what they found in their teeth, the way their injuries healed, other nuanced stuff like evidence of traumatic injuries, but they still came back from them and they were still able to live lives, so they were probably more cooperative than most people gave them credit for, and that they had some sort of system in place that they had compassion and they cared for each other, and they weren't cold-hearted brutes as other scientists make them out to be. And remember, this is all, a lot of it circumstantial, but it's still interesting to see the researchers' thought process and how they perceive this data that they have and what they're looking for and what strikes them a certain way enough for them to report it in this report by David Robson. He's a journalist who wrote this article, and he basically went around and talked to all these scientists and got their 2 cents, asked them their reasoning, why they thought certain things, what ought to be looked at, what ought to be investigated, and the next logical steps to help solidify their theory that these Neanderthals had some sort of, not overly sophisticated, but they had some system in place where they helped each other out. And for example, they had they knew about splinting bones, antibacterial, basic knowledge of antibacterial plants and that kind of stuff. So first of all, he lays out that Neanderthals had a bunch of different injuries due to the nature of their life. I mean, they had to hunt big game. They had to cross pretty unforgiving terrain, like the sides of mountains and stuff, to get at the game. Like, for example, in Spain, they had ibex hunters, and ibex are pretty nimble. So basically, they had a difficult life. Also, there's some evidence that they had wars with each other, and all the way down to dental, the tooth abscesses and stuff like that. So the astute observation here is that many of these individuals appear to have survived for months or even years after their injuries. So how is that possible? How are they not just getting ravaged by disease? And if they have an open wound, like some of these injuries suggest, how are they surviving the bacteria and bacterial infections? So these are pretty valid questions, and obviously there's no concrete answers because there's no concrete evidence, but again, this is definitely worth talking about, because if one day there are answers to these questions, then it would profoundly alter our view of what was going on 40,000 plus years ago when the Neanderthals were around and alive and kicking. So compared to modern humans, they're often thought to have lacked the necessary compassion or cognitive ability to look after the sick. And here's another observation from Penny Spikins. She's the archaeologist from the University of York in the UK. And for the most part, she's doing a lot of the talking, and she's the one getting interviewed here. She says they must have been helped by others, and in some cases that help must have been knowledgeable and quite well planned. Just because, in light of all this, what I was detailing earlier, their survival would have only been possible, in other words, if they had sophisticated healthcare. So I think when she says sophisticated healthcare, I think she means the ability to find issues with somebody and find the appropriate remedy. And I don't think she means like they had some sort of technology or anything like that. I think she just means like standard like wound dressing, fever management, midwifery, that's interesting, which we'll get into later, and a pharmacopoeia of herbal remedies. So all these are probably, I guess most scientists kind of assume that they had these capabilities, but it doesn't, through all the literature up until now, they don't really, it's not it's not a huge focus, or it hasn't been until recent history. So she thinks that once they developed these abilities, they were able to change the course of their evolution, which is definitely true. Obviously, you have better healthcare, you live longer, you can pass certain skills down, and then therefore increasing the odds of your offspring living a more safe life. At least I think that's what she's getting at. So what she did was she did previous research on the motives of Neanderthal healthcare. So what are some plausible motives for them to do this? So she cites one example from Shanidar Cave in Iraq, an individual who survived for over 10 years despite a withered arm and head injuries that would have probably resulted in sight and hearing loss. I think specifically this individual had some sort of blunt force head injury, and I think their arm got crushed. Basically, they got messed up somehow or some way, and they probably lost an eyeball or something like that. They were maimed, and there was no way for them to continue on without someone's help. She continues, it's impossible. The survival would have been impossible unless other members had provided him with food, water, and shelter. A level of altruism not typically associated with the Neanderthal mind. So I said earlier that a lot of they're perceived as these brutes who lived in, if they're either alone or they lived in very small groups, very inclusive groups, or exclusive groups rather, that they weren't compassionate. She's saying the evidence can be interpreted otherwise, and there's a compelling case for that. So this paper now builds on this observation by examining the specific medical skills involved in such a level of care. They have a huge record of these bones, and there are a lot of fractures that healed without deformities. Suggests that they had been set with a primitive splint. Now, I don't know a lot about medical science, and I'm not a medical professional, but I'm assuming that she had some, probably more than one person with medical background to really have a side-by-side comparison between a fracture that heals without any sort of treatment and one that does. And then basically she probably had someone examine and observe the evidence, so to speak, or what evidence they had, rather than just conjecture by saying, oh yeah, there's no deformities, therefore it had been set with a splint somehow. I think there is some documentation that backs this up. Many of these wounds, such as the severe head trauma and broken ribs, probably would have resulted in significant blood loss and increased risk of infection. But they survived long enough for the bones to heal. There remains signs of severe infection. Spikins is saying this would be apparent in lumps and bumps on the bone edges. That shows like the wear and tear, and something like these lumps and bumps indicate that there was damage, but it got better. And so in order for that to happen, that doesn't happen overnight, that they needed to be taken care of, at least in the interim, before they're ready to get back out there and hunt. I don't know, maybe the Neanderthals had some sort of extraordinary healing capabilities, because I don't want to compare them to dogs, but I know animals, and including dogs, they get a cut. You treat it a little bit, you put a little bit of a ointment on there or something, within 2 or 3 days it's completely gone. I mean, they have it's like Wolverine, they have crazy regenerative powers. So maybe the Neanderthals had a better immune system than we did, or a better recuperative, their bodies were probably more, well, we know that their bodies were bigger and stronger than ours, so why wouldn't they be more robust health-wise than us? So I don't know, maybe their bodies are more hardy. But who knows? Maybe that's still not enough to compensate for the types of traumatic injury they're getting. I mean, that guy had a skull fracture, and he was nearly blind, and he came back from that, or he was able to survive. All of this suggests that Neanderthals had some means of dressing wounds. Spikins doesn't know exactly what those methods were, but she points out that bandages can be made from animal parts. The fact that she doesn't know exactly what those methods were, it's kind of impossible to know that, pretty much, unless there's some sort of extraordinary smoking gun evidence that comes out, or some sort of instrument that is undeniably used for dressing wounds. And this is what critics will take out. They'll just cite lack of evidence for a lot of these claims, and that's why I said earlier that a lot of these are circumstantial. But again, these are astute observations that should not be ignored and should be taken into consideration moving forward. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And then she goes on to describe there are instances of Inuit groups using lemming skin to dress wounds, so it's not unheard of. But they probably didn't use cloth bandages or anything like that, because there's no traces of that. Neanderthals may have even been in command of some natural drugs to speed their recovery. And again, Shanidar Cave is cited, and they were buried with numerous plants to have medicinal properties, including yarrow. And then it was used to reduce fevers and such, treat viral infections such as influenza. They think that this might have been a sign of some level of health care during the life of that individual. And then the author talks about Karen Hardy. She's a researcher at the Catalan Institution for Research in Barcelona, and so she was studying the calcified plaque on Neanderthal teeth, and from there they were able to extract traces of food, and what they found were chemical signatures of yarrow and chamomile, which are two anti-inflammatory agents. So the reason, big deal, right? They find these two plants and traces of these plants in their system. Well, if you look at those two things by themselves, they're extremely bitter, so any living being would probably be averse to eating those by itself. And there's no nutritional value, if any. There's very little. So the only real motive for them to eat that is for self-medicating. And that makes a lot of sense to me too. Although there's no evidence, right? We're never going to know why there was these trace amounts of these agents in the person's teeth. But this individual they had a tooth abscess. So go figure, right? So you just got to put two and two together. Some people think that's still circumstantial, which I guess it is, technically. But if you want to, going by deduction, if you're Sherlock, you're probably going to think, oh yeah, they probably did this to treat this abscess, which at the time, a tooth abscess is a big deal. No dentist, that must be hugely painful. They can't even chew their food if it gets that bad. And then they also found parasites too, which cause diarrhea in humans, so maybe they were suffering from this as well. And apparently those two herbs also help with those types of infections as well. So it could either be the abscess or the bacteria that causes diarrhea, or both. And then we're going to go to midwifery here. This is really interesting. So just like modern humans, the size and shape of a Neanderthal's baby's heads to the mother's pelvis would have made unassisted childbirth dangerous. So in order for them to have kept going, there must have been, for the most part, someone assisting with the childbirth. And if you guys know, there's a way you twist the baby out. And if you don't do that, there's a high risk that the baby might get hurt. So in order to reduce the mortality rates, they would have had some sort of midwifery, or so her thinking goes. Again, this is not all this is laid out in stone. These are all just observations and some level of assumptions, but educated assumptions, I would say. Neanderthal healthcare was remarkably similar to our own ancestors' strategies. The research might also help us to better understand Neanderthals' long-term adaptations to their environment. So they had, like I said, I mentioned earlier, they had dangerous lives. They had to hunt large game. They had to go across mountainous terrain where they could fall, break their arm, their leg, twist an ankle. And not to mention saber-toothed tigers lived back then. There were packs of hyenas and other megafauna that were hunting them as well. They weren't the absolute top of the food chain. So injury rates were very high. One estimate suggested between 70 and 94% Neanderthals sustained at least one traumatic injury. I don't know how they came to that number, and I don't know how they would come to that, but I guess a lot of the bones that they found, a great percentage of them were someone had some sort of injury at some point. It does make sense too, since childbirth already was hard to survive, right? If you're a baby, and then the ones who do survived, they're gonna have to hunt. There's no sitting around. Everybody's participating in the hunt. So I guess that is a believable statistic. Healthcare allowed groups to sustain much higher rates of injury than they would otherwise be able to sustain, so they move into an ecological niche that they weren't really well suited for. I guess what she's saying is, if they did have healthcare, then it makes sense that they would move into other parts of the ecology or the earth, basically, to gather whatever they can. They weren't constrained by their lack of health to a certain safe zone, so to speak. They really ventured out further and further because they were able to and then because of that, it increased survival rates, which allowed greater cultural complexity to flourish, because the older generation shares their knowledge, the younger members, and then there are more members who are older, and then after a few generations they have this cumulative knowledge base that travels within tribes and then their tribes cultivate their own knowledge essentially, and then they develop more sophisticated ways of hunting, and then because the future generations have this bedrock of information of what to do, what not to do, and they kind of had this roadmap for survival, it increased their odds and they were able to build from there. So the whole midwife thing makes sense because there's a huge biological incentive there, cultural and biological incentive there for them to survive. And survival's usually, that's reptilian brain stuff, right? That's like the first that's the first priority of each individual is survival, and midwifery is a huge part of that equation. She calls for Spikers calls for an investigation to see if midwifery allowed for the continued evolution of the brain. Although they had bigger brains than us, so I don't know. Maybe it wasn't as developed, even though it was bigger. I don't know. Again, there needs to be a study, like she says. She thinks the study could reveal ways these cultural practices can impact our biological evolution, because there's no doubt that it does. Cultural practices do affect, in some way, biological evolution. So it would be interesting to see a more detailed, higher resolution snapshot of what's really going on, how it does impact the evolution of our brains and their brains. A lot of archaeologists are cautious. They think a lot of evidence is circumstantial because you can only infer so much from these injuries, and it's impossible to know for certain what they were ingesting or why they were ingesting, or not what, but why they were ingesting what they were doing, why they were ingesting what they were ingesting. That's impossible to know for 100% certainty. Little hard evidence, because what survives after 40,000 plus years or so? Other animals have been known to self-medicate to a limited degree, and they would like more direct comparisons with anatomically modern humans and other primates to see whether the healthcare adaptations differed between groups. Yeah, that's the next logical step. Study, research, and make comparisons of how primates now, whatever, run the gamut, orangutans, apes, chimps, bonobos, and us, modern humans, and compare the healthcare adaptations. What do primates do? Do they address infections? Do they address child rearing somehow? Do they address midwifery? Do they address herbs? Like, do they gather herbs? Do they know what holds what properties, and so on and so forth? Do they know about splinting broken bones? And what happens when a monkey breaks their arm in the wild? What do they do? Do they just live with it? I don't know. I've never thought about that. In principle, however, the existence of more sophisticated healthcare chimes with the burgeoning recognition of Neanderthal intelligence. So this is a thing. Neanderthals are getting more and more credit, so to speak, in terms of their intellectual ability. Because remember, maybe less than 100 years ago, and even some of the people who've been in the field for decades now, there is some sort of bias against the Neanderthals because of the brutish description they were given from the get-go, because people didn't want to accept that we either came from Neanderthals or they're part of our gene pool. But there's no doubt about it that they are our cousins. So there should be no reason to suspect they were very different from us, because we are a part of them, according to the genetic data. Some people still don't believe that at all. Capabilities as members of the human family, we should recognize that. And rather than presuming them to be simple-minded brutes of popular folklore, right? Making them unreal. I don't know. What do you guys think? I know a lot of you guys have a lot of viewpoints on Neanderthals and Denisovans and Homo erectus, Heidelbergensis, Floresiensis. We have a lot of human cousins. And what do you guys think? What's your opinion in light of this, in light of stuff that wasn't involved in this report? Have you guys heard anything about Neanderthal and anything relating to Neanderthal intelligence or medical practices? How far back does it go? Maybe the passing on of knowledge, midwifery. Any comments related to these? I'm all ears. But I think this is really interesting that all these insights are being made, and there's not as much pushback against it as there was in the past. I mean, a lot now they're open to the idea. They just want to see more hard evidence, which is fine. But I mean, what other hard evidence is there? I guess we just got to keep excavating everything or get a fresh pair of eyes on the evidence that we have now, and put all the observations together and weed out what makes the most sense. But really, all we can do is speculate still, even when we reach that scenario. So I'm inclined to believe that they were above animals for sure in terms of intelligence and cooperation and forward-thinking ability. I mean, what's more forward-thinking than taking care of the older generation, right? And the fact that it's highly suggested that they did care for their older generation means that there was a motive there, and there's a motive for everything. So what was their motive? Well, it was probably survival, right? Because why else would you carry old people around with you and keep them around with you? I mean, one, there's the kinship thing. I mean, I don't think any modern human would just, under normal circumstances, would just throw their parents under the bus when it came time. And I don't think Neanderthals would do the same unless they were a huge burden on them, like they were abusive or something like that. But if they had some sort of, let's say that they were a successful hunter for years and years, and then they get old, and then say they get hurt, they break their arm or something, and they're kind of maimed. They would, if they had a language too, they probably would keep them around, right? And then, did they have a language? How sophisticated was their language? So there's all these questions. Anyway, I'm rambling. Please let me know in the comments what you guys think, and I'll see you tomorrow.